Imagine holding your newborn child, only to wake one morning and find something has changed. The baby won't stop crying. The baby won't eat right. The baby looks at you with eyes that seem ancient, knowing wrong. For centuries, parents across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and beyond lived with a terrifying explanation. Fairies had stolen their real child and left a replacement. The changeling belief is one of the most widespread myths in Celtic folklore. At its heart, it's about loss, about the desperate need to explain why a healthy infant might suddenly sicken. The word comes from Middle English chongan, meaning to exchange. Your precious child taken away, something else left sleeping in the cradle. The changeling myth spread across the entire Celtic world. Ireland stands at the centre, with the richest collection preserved in medieval manuscripts. These early writings describe children who were elf-taken, spirited away by supernatural beings. Cross to Scotland, and you find the same fears. Travel to Wales, Cornwall, or the Isle of Man, and the pattern repeats. Beyond the Celtic fringe, similar beliefs existed in Germany and Scandinavia. The earliest written accounts trace back to medieval Irish manuscripts that casually mention these events as if describing weather. The monks who recorded pagan beliefs without skepticism tells us this was a mainstream understanding of how the world worked. In rural Ireland during the 18th and 19th centuries, more than 150 babies died for every 1,000 births. 1 in 7 families knew the grief of losing a child. These deaths came suddenly, without visible cause. A baby thriving 1 week could waste away the next. Parents had no way to understand what was happening. Imagine being that parent. You live in a stone cottage. The nearest doctor is a day's travel away. Your baby is sick. You have no medicine, no way to call for help. You need an explanation, and your culture offers one. This is not your child anymore. The fairies have taken your real baby. This explanation did several things at once. It preserved the memory of your real child as perfect, taken away rather than transformed by illness. It provided a target for grief, not fate but fairy malice. It suggested action might be possible. The real child was said to be living in Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, while what the fairies left behind was a weak fairy child or an elderly fairy in disguise. The changeling belief functioned as a shared framework for making sense of tragedy. Ethnographers documented these beliefs well into the early 1900s. They found people who spoke casually about fairy interventions. They recorded testimony from midwives who incorporated fairy protection into practice. The belief system had internal logic. Fairies were most active at certain times: twilight, Samhain, Beltane. Certain places were dangerous: fairy rings, ancient burial mounds. Certain precautions worked: iron, holy water, rowan wood, immediate baptism. This created a complete explanatory framework that could never be disproven. Word spread through villages when a baby fell ill. Neighbours brought their own stories of changelings suspected or confirmed. Each story reinforced the others. This is how belief becomes reality in a community, through consensus, through shared storytelling, through the desperate human need to make meaning from suffering. The changeling belief filled a void where modern explanations didn't exist. It gave parents a way to process unbearable grief and gave communities a shared language for discussing infant death. Stories that are old don't vanish overnight. They linger in caution, in the uneasy feeling some people still get near fairy forts. Next, we'll step into the fairy realm itself. Having explored where the changeling fear originated, we journey to where stolen children were supposedly taken. For believers, this was a real location, just hidden from ordinary sight. The fairy realm goes by many names, but the most evocative is Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. Imagine a place where no one ages, where time moves differently. A single day there might equal years back home. You could visit and return to find everyone you knew dead of old age. So where exactly was Tir na Nog? Everywhere and nowhere. The fairy realm existed parallel to the human world, separated by the thinnest of veils. The primary access points were beneath green hills inside ancient burial mounds. These were Bronze Age and Neolithic tombs, built thousands of years before the Celts arrived. Massive monuments like Newgrange and Noath seemed impossible without modern tools. What else could they be but gateways to another world? The locals called them fairy forts or seed mounds. Even today, farmers plough around them rather than through them. Construction projects get delayed or rerouted. However, the fairy realm wasn't only underground. Some stories placed it across invisible seas. Other tales described it in forests where fairy rings formed, natural circles of mushrooms considered doorways. Running water marked boundaries, rivers and streams were liminal spaces. Bridges were dangerous at twilight. The fairies moved most easily when the world was between states, between day and night, between seasons. Now, these fairies weren't tiny winged creatures. They were the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods of Ireland, displaced but still powerful. Before human Celts arrived, the land was ruled by divine beings whose name means the people of the goddess Danu. Lu was the god of light and skill. The Dagda was a father figure, powerful in magic. Brigid governed poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Then came the Milesians, ancestors of mortal humans, and they defeated the Tuatha De Danann. But the gods didn't die. Instead, they made a treaty. The Milesians would rule the surface. The Tuatha De Danann would rule underground. They retreated beneath the hills, becoming the Aesi, the people of the mounds. Early Christian scribes classified them as fallen angels, who sided neither with God nor Satan. They were cast down to earth, neither divine nor demonic. The result was a fairy folk who were majestic and terrible in equal measure. Three qualities defined the fairy realm. First, no aging. You could live forever in youth. One story pattern involves a mortal who spends what feels like a year there, returns home, and crumbles to dust because 300 years have passed. Second, no death. When a fairy child sickened, they couldn't simply reproduce normally. They were frozen, immortal but sterile or weak. Human vitality became necessary to strengthen their bloodlines. Third, time distortion. Sometimes a day there equaled a year on Earth. A parent whose child was stolen might recover them. But what would return? A baby taken 20 years ago might still be an infant in fairy time, or might have lived through centuries. The stories describe impossible beauty, but also strangeness that tipped into wrongness. Food that tasted of nothing. Beauty so perfect it became disturbing. These descriptions mirror dreamlike states, as if reality worked differently there. Consider how this belief affected daily behavior. Every hill might be hollow. Every clearing might be a gathering place. You moved through your own country as if walking through someone else's house. The Feast of Samhain marked when the veil grew thinnest. Beltane carried similar dangers. People left offerings not out of worship but diplomacy. Milk poured near a fairy fort, butter left on a stone. Homes had protections, iron thresholds, rowan wood over doorways. Cradles had iron nails driven into them. This world view created double vision. You saw ordinary landscape and an enchanted landscape overlaid on top. Your child hadn't just been kidnapped. Your child had been taken to a different dimension where time and death work differently. We'll explore next why fairies bothered taking human children. Having journeyed to the fairy realm, we face the question that troubled every parent. Why would powerful beings bother stealing human babies? The fascinating thing is that changeling lore doesn't offer one answer. The tradition preserved multiple competing motives. Different regions emphasize different reasons. This variety tells us people were genuinely trying to understand real tragedies. The first set centers on vulnerability. The fairy folk, despite their power, supposedly struggled with reproduction. The most common reason was that fairies needed to replace dying fairy infants with healthy human ones. Many versions specified that fairy children were weak and sickly, unable to thrive. A dying fairy baby might be swapped for a thriving human one. Another explanation focused on bloodline strengthening. Fairies envied human vitality, the fierce existence that comes from knowing your time is limited. Taking human children would introduce fresh vigor into their lines. Scottish tales emphasize that unbaptized children were vulnerable. Parents rushed to baptize infants within hours. Some stories said fairies needed servants. Human children taken young could be trained to play music for fairy dances, to prepare feasts. This appears in stories where stolen children return with impossible skills. A boy able to play the fiddle like a master, despite never having lessons. Moving to the second category, many tales described fairy abductions as debt collection. A human had offended the fairy queen or broken fairy law, and the penalty was a child. Cutting down a hawthorn tree, building too close to a fairy mound. The payment was always steep. This created a supernatural justice system operating invisibly. Some versions specified that fairies could only take what was freely given. A mother who complained too bitterly about her crying baby might be heard by fairies and interpreted as offering the child away. Words had power. Other stories framed it in terms of fairy envy of mortal souls. Fairies, classified as fallen angels, supposedly lacked true souls. Stealing human children was an attempt to acquire what they eternally lacked. This belief shaped behavior. Parents couldn't love their children openly. They had to hide their pride, avoid praising babies where fairies might hear. The third category centers on pure jealousy. The fairy realm was eternal and unchanging. For beings who once were gods, this might become unbearably boring. Mortals lived fully. Every experience was heightened by impermanence. So fairies envied mortality itself, the urgent beauty of lives that end. This appears in stories where fairies simply take the child because they want it. Beauty made children vulnerable. A baby born with a caul, indicating second sight. Twins, always considered uncanny. Musical talent created particular risk. Fairies needed musicians for their endless revels. The revenge motive fits here too. Sometimes they did it to punish human behavior. Taking children reminded mortals of their place. The changeling left behind would be deliberately troublesome, crying endlessly, refusing all comfort. The emotional explanations reveal the most about human psychology. These stories gave parents permission to feel ambivalent about difficult children. If your baby cried constantly, the changeling belief offered an out. This wasn't your child, but it also enabled horror. What might you do to drive away a fairy imposter? What ties these explanations together is power and vulnerability. The fairies had supernatural power, but lacked vitality, souls, the beauty of impermanence. Mortals had these precious things, but lacked power to protect them. This dynamic created permanent tension. You couldn't ignore the fairies because they could harm you, but you couldn't confront them directly. Next, we'll learn the specific signs that revealed whether a child was truly a changeling. Understanding why fairies supposedly stole children brings us to a darker question. How did parents know whether their child was a changeling? The identification system was detailed and specific. This is where belief meets reality in the harshest way. What makes this tragic is how these diagnostic features aligned with real medical conditions that weren't understood. The most commonly cited sign was a baby that ate excessively but remained thin. Parents would feed the child constantly, yet the infant never gained weight, never seemed nourished by mortal food. Another marker was sudden bodily changes. A baby might suddenly stiffen, or the body might seem to shrink, to waste away visibly. Some stories describe changelings as having wrinkled features, like old men trapped in infants' bodies. The face would carry an aged quality. The eyes would seem ancient, carrying knowledge no infant should possess. Modern historians see something heartbreaking. These symptoms align with medical conditions poorly understood at the time. Failure to thrive, where infants don't gain weight despite adequate feeding. Rickets, causing bone deformities. Genetic disorders affecting metabolism. Consider cerebral palsy, causing muscle stiffness. To parents without medical knowledge, sudden rigidity might seem like transformation. Moving beyond physical symptoms, the most frequently mentioned behavior was constant, inconsolable crying. The changelings supposedly cried day and night, refused all comfort, drove the household to exhaustion. Another suspicious behavior was unusual intelligence or adult-like expressions. An infant who made knowing eye contact, who seemed to understand conversations. Early ability to speak, sing, or recite rhymes marked a suspected changeling. If a very young child suddenly began speaking in full sentences, this suggested fairy origins. The precocity wasn't celebrated. It was terrifying. Some stories describe changelings refusing to sleep, lying awake all night with those ancient eyes. Modern medical knowledge casts these behaviors differently. Constant crying could indicate colic, reflux, ear infections, neurological conditions causing pain. Unusual intelligence might be signs of autism spectrum disorder. Some autistic children speak late, then suddenly use complex language. Refusal to sleep could indicate digestive problems, respiratory issues, neurological disorders. Finally, the folklore claimed changelings would react in specific ways to certain objects. Iron was the ultimate test. A changeling supposedly couldn't tolerate iron, would recoil from it. Parents might place iron scissors under the cradle to see how it reacted. Fire provoked similar reactions. Holding the baby over the hearth supposedly forced the changeling to reveal itself. Holy water represented another test. Sprinkling blessed water should make a changeling react violently. The most elaborate test involved boiling eggshells. The absurdity of boiling water inside eggshells was so unusual that the changeling couldn't help but comment, revealing its true age. These tests tell us nothing about fairy substitution. A baby crying near iron, perhaps startled by cold metal. A child reacting to fire. Any infant would be distressed by heat. Consider how these categories work together. A child who ate constantly but stayed thin, who cried without stopping, who seemed to understand too much, who reacted badly to iron. To parents steeped in folklore, this was proof. The diagnostic criteria for changelings match symptoms of various medical conditions, developmental disorders, and disabilities. Autism, cerebral palsy, colic, failure to thrive. None of these children were fairy substitutes. All were human children dealing with conditions their parents couldn't understand. But folklore filled the gap and suggested remedies. When you believe your suffering child is a malevolent fairy creature, when you believe the right ritual might bring your real baby back, what won't you try? Next, we'll explore the cures and countermeasures people used. Having learned the supposed signs, we face what people did about it. The folklore offered preventive measures to protect newborns and aggressive interventions to drive out a changeling. What makes this important is understanding the line between protective folk practices and dangerous actions. Iron stood as the primary defense. Parents placed iron tools near cradles, scissors laid open under the mattress, nails driven into the frame, horseshoes hung above doors. Iron supposedly repelled fairy folk. The metal had to touch the cradle directly. Why iron? It represented human technology, mastery of earth and fire. Fairies, as beings of the old world, couldn't tolerate this symbol. Baptism provided religious protection. Parents rushed to have infants baptized within days, creating a sacred bond that supposedly made the child harder to claim. This urgency had practical religious benefits. It ensured high infant mortality didn't result in unbaptized souls. The Church encouraged rapid baptism, and fairy folklore provided additional motivation. Certain plants offered protection. Rowan wood hung over doors, hawthorn branches, salt sprinkled across thresholds. Offerings played a diplomatic role. Milk, butter, bread left at fairy forts acknowledged the fairies' presence, showing respect. Some protections were elaborate. A mother might never leave her newborn alone in the first 40 days. Someone always watched the cradle. This constant vigilance exhausted families, but seemed a small price. Clothing played a role too. Turning a baby's clothes inside out supposedly confused the fairies. Red thread sewn into garments offered protection. These preventive measures reveal how deeply fear penetrated daily life. Every moment required vigilance. The boundary between practical and magical dissolved completely. Moving to the second category, once parents suspected a changeling, they needed confirmation. The eggshell test was relatively mild. Boiling water in empty eggshells while watching for reaction. Another test involved playing music. Fairies supposedly couldn't resist dancing, so if a sickly baby suddenly perked up and moved rhythmically, that might indicate fairy nature. Threatening the child represented a darker form of testing. Parents might verbally threaten to throw the baby into fire, watching to see if it reacted with fear disproportionate to an infant's understanding. Some tests involved temporary discomfort, holding the baby near smoke, placing it on cold ground. These tests created a terrible feedback loop. A sick or disabled child would react to stresses in ways that confirmed suspicion. A child with sensory sensitivities might react strongly to smoke or cold. Every test that caused distress produced results that seemed to validate the theory. Finally, we reach aggressive interventions designed to force fairies to return the stolen child. The logic was simple. Make conditions so unpleasant that fairies would take it back. One common intervention involved leaving the suspected changeling outside overnight, particularly on a riverbank or near a fairy fort. Parents would leave the baby at dusk and return at dawn, hoping to find their real child. The danger is obvious. An infant left outside faced exposure, hypothermia, death. If the baby survived, parents interpreted this as proof of changeling nature. If it died, the grief was softened. They'd only lost a changeling. Fire represented the most extreme intervention. Folklore claimed holding a suspected changeling over flames would force it to reveal its true nature, or compel fairies to take it back. In practice, parents held babies over hearth fires for minutes, watching for supernatural reactions. Some children suffered burns. Some died. Consider the documented case of Bridget Cleary in 1895. Her husband became convinced she'd been replaced by a fairy. He subjected her to tests, holding her over fire, forcing her to drink herbal concoctions. Eventually, he burned her alive, believing this would force fairies to return to his real wife. He was convicted of manslaughter. An earlier case from 1826 involved Anne Roche, accused of drowning a 4-year-old boy during a changeling exorcism. She'd immersed the child in a river repeatedly, believing cold water shock would drive out the fairy spirit. The child died. These weren't isolated incidents. Court records document multiple cases where children died during changeling interventions. The perpetrators genuinely believed they were fighting to save their real children. They saw themselves as victims, not abusers. What makes these countermeasures tragic is the love behind them. These weren't parents who didn't care. These were parents who cared desperately, willing to try anything. The changeling belief offered hope. Your real child still exists somewhere. You just need to get them back. That hope, combined with desperation and lack of medical alternatives, created conditions where rational people committed irrational acts. Modern understanding requires holding two truths. The interventions were abusive and lethal, yet the parents were often genuinely trying to save their children within the only framework their culture provided. The decline of these practices coincided with several changes. Medical knowledge penetrated rural areas. Education spread. Legal authorities prosecuted cases of child abuse regardless of fairy justifications. Most importantly, infant mortality gradually declined. As more babies survived, the desperate need for supernatural explanations weakened. Next, we'll explore how the Tuatha De Danann became the fairies of these stories. Having seen how changeling beliefs shaped daily life, we need to understand who these fairies were. They weren't always child-stealing beings. They began as gods, divine rulers of Ireland, before history transformed them. The story of the Tuatha De Danann is fundamentally about what happens to gods when they lose power. It's about how the divine adjusts to life among mortals, how mythology evolves under new beliefs without abandoning the old. The Tuatha De Danann, whose name means the people of the goddess Danu, were the pantheon of ancient Ireland. These were major deities governing every aspect of existence: war, peace, harvest, craft, poetry, healing, death. Each deity had specific domains. Lu, the god of light, mastered every skill. The Dagda served as father figure, wielding a massive club that could kill with one end and resurrect with the other. Brigid governed poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Danu herself, the mother goddess, was the source from which all others flowed. Other members included Morrigan, goddess of war and fate; Ogma, god of eloquence and writing; Nuada, the first king who lost his hand in battle and had it replaced with a silver prosthetic. These deities weren't distant or abstract. They walked among mortals, involved themselves in human affairs, took lovers, fought wars, shaped the landscape. According to medieval texts, the Tuatha De Danann arrived in Ireland through the air, in a great mist. They brought 4 treasures: the stone of Fal, which shrieked when the rightful king stood upon it; the spear of Lu, guaranteeing victory; the sword of Nuada, from which no one could escape; the cauldron of the Dagda, providing endless food. For a time, the Tuatha De Danann ruled Ireland completely. They defeated the Firbolg. They fought off the Fomorians, primordial beings of chaos. They established kingship and law across the land. Then came the Milesians, ancestors of the Gaelic Irish, mortal humans. They represented the final invasion, the last group to claim Ireland. The Tuatha De Danann and Milesians fought, but the outcome was strange. They made a treaty, dividing Ireland between them. The Milesians would rule the surface. The Tuatha De Danann would rule underground. They retreated into the Cid, the burial mounds, and continued their existence out of mortal sight. This transformation from gods to fairies happened gradually in cultural memory. The Tuatha De Danann retained power but lost prominence. The arrival of Christianity was crucial. The Church couldn't simply erase the old gods. They were too deeply embedded. Instead, Christian scholars reframed them as fallen angels, beings who sided neither with God nor Satan during the war in heaven. This reclassification was brilliant. It acknowledged the Tuatha De Danann's power while denying divinity. They weren't demons to be fought. They weren't gods to be worshipped. They were something in between, deserving caution but not reverence. As generations passed, the Tuatha De Danann faded further and became the fairy folk. In Irish, they were the sea, or the good people, or the gentry. People avoided speaking their names directly, using euphemisms because naming them might attract attention. This transformation explains why Celtic fairies are so different from Victorian fantasy. Celtic fairies were tall, powerful, majestic. They commanded magic that could shape reality. They demanded respect because they were, fundamentally, diminished gods who remembered being worshipped. The changeling myths make more sense in this context. These weren't minor spirits playing pranks. These were former deities, forced underground but still powerful, still capable of interfering in mortal affairs. When they stole children, it was an assertion of power, a reminder that mortals couldn't ignore them. Consider how this affected medieval Irish society. The people remembered when the Tuatha De Danann were gods deserving worship. But the Church now taught Christianity. The compromise was to treat the old gods as fairies, powerful but not divine, present but not worshipped. This created a unique situation where Ireland had two parallel belief systems. Christianity governed the spiritual realm. Fairy belief governed the physical realm, explaining natural phenomena, illness, fortune. You could be a devout Christian and still believe in fairies. These weren't contradictory. Some saints absorbed characteristics of the old gods. Saint Bridget took on many attributes of the goddess Bridget. The feast day aligned with the old goddess's festival. The Church allowed this syncretism because it eased transition. The Tuatha De Danann's story is ultimately about adaptation. They were gods who became something else rather than vanish. They accepted diminishment as the price of continued existence, and in that marginal position, they remained powerful enough to shape human life through changeling thefts, crop failures, fortune and misfortune. Next, we'll explore the specific rules that govern interactions between humans and these beings. Understanding who the fairies were brings us to how mortals navigated living alongside them. The answer lies in fairy lore, an intricate system of rules and taboos. Break these rules, and consequences follow. Fairy lore wasn't written. It was an oral tradition passed from grandmother to grandchild. Yet for something unwritten, it was remarkably consistent across Celtic regions. The most sacred fairy lore concerned specific locations. Fairy trees stood as the most visible markers. Hawthorn trees, particularly lone ones standing in fields, were fairy property. Cutting one down could bring disaster. Farmers would plough around fairy trees, leaving them standing even though they were inconvenient. Modern Ireland still respects this. Road construction projects have been rerouted to avoid fairy trees. In 1999, a construction project in County Clare was delayed because the planned route required cutting a hawthorn tree locals considered a fairy bush. The delay cost money and time, but the locals understood. You don't anger the folk. Fairy forts represented another protected category. These were ring forts from the Iron Age, scattered across rural Ireland. In folklore, they were fairy dwellings, entrances to the underground realm. Disturbing a fairy fort brought terrible luck. Farmers left them alone, even when the land would be more productive if levelled. Fairy rings, those natural circles of mushrooms, marked temporary fairy gatherings. Stepping inside one, particularly at night, could trap you. The rule was simple. See a fairy ring, walk around it, never through it. Running water created boundaries that fairies hesitated to cross. Bridges were liminal spaces. Crossroads held similar power. Smart travellers would pause at these places and speak a blessing or leave an offering. Moving beyond territorial rules, certain times carried heightened danger. Samhain, celebrated on Halloween, marked the most dangerous night. This was when the veil between worlds grew thinnest. On Samhain night, families stayed indoors after sunset. Children born on Samhain carried special vulnerability. Beltane, celebrated on May 1st, marked another threshold moment. Cattle were particularly vulnerable. Farmers drove their herds between two fires for protection. Twilight, that daily threshold between day and night, was when fairies moved most freely. People hurried home as sunset approached. Finally, behavioral rules govern how humans should conduct themselves. The most fundamental: never boast about your children, your health, your fortune. Boasting attracted fairy attention and envy. Better to describe your healthy child as plain, troublesome. This verbal superstition persisted long after explicit fairy belief faded. Never thank the fairies directly. If you suspect fairy help, acknowledge it obliquely. Direct thanks implied a contract that might bind you. Respect for fairy processions was crucial. If you encounter the fairy host riding out, step aside immediately. Avert your eyes. Let them pass. Never eat food offered in fairy dwellings. Consuming fairy food binds you to the fairy realm. Even a single bite could trap you there. Similarly, never reveal your true name to a fairy. Names held power. Knowing your name gave the fairy leverage over you. These rules weren't occasional concerns. They were constantly navigating. Every time you left your house, you assessed whether the time was safe. Every field you crossed, you noted fairy trees. Every compliment about your children, you bit back or turned into a complaint. This created a landscape dense with meaning and danger. The physical geography overlaid with invisible geography of fairy places and rules. You learned it young, internalized it completely, taught it to your children with the same seriousness as teaching them to avoid cliffs. Fairy lore reveals something about living with uncertainty and limited control. You can't eliminate danger completely, but you can learn the rules, follow precautions, and hope that proper behavior earns protection. When someone broke the rules, cut down a fairy tree, built on a fairy fort, the community could explain whatever bad luck followed. The explanation provided comfort. The world wasn't random. Actions had consequences. Next, we'll see how Christianity interacted with these beliefs. Having explored the fairy lore that governed Celtic life, we need to understand how Christianity changed the changeling narrative. The Church didn't simply replace old beliefs with new ones. Instead, a complex negotiation occurred where pagan and Christian ideas merged. This interaction reveals how religious change actually happens. It's rarely clean or complete. It's negotiation, compromise, creative reinterpretation that lets people maintain cultural identity while adopting a new religious framework. When Christianity spread through Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries, monks encountered a landscape full of old gods, fairy beings, pagan sacred sites. They couldn't ignore these beliefs. They were too deeply embedded. Instead, Christian scholars developed theological explanations acknowledging fairy existence while denying fairy divinity. The most influential reframing classified fairies as fallen angels. When Lucifer rebelled against God, some angels hesitated, remaining neutral. These neutral angels were cast down to earth as punishment, but weren't sent to hell because they hadn't actively rebelled. These fallen but not damned angels became the fairies. This classification was a brilliant strategy. It allowed Irish Christians to continue believing in fairies without contradicting church teaching. The fairies were real, just not gods. They were dangerous, but not devils to be exorcised. They occupied a middle ground that felt familiar to Celtic sensibility. The reclassification changed how people understood changeling events. When fairies were old gods, stealing children was divine caprice. When fairies became fallen angels, the same act became spiritual warfare, an attack from beings who envied human souls. This shift made baptism even more crucial. As Christian sacrament against fallen angels, baptism became essential armor. The Church provided new tools for fairy protection that replaced or supplemented older pagan methods. Holy water became the primary defensive weapon. Priests blessed water, transforming ordinary liquid into spiritually potent substance. Families kept holy water in homes, sprinkled it in cradles, used it to bless doorways. Notice how this paralleled older practice. Water from sacred wells had always carried protective power. Holy water simply redirected that belief, giving it Christian source and meaning. Crucifixes replaced or joined iron scissors as protective objects. Hanging a crucifix above a baby's crib made theological sense. You were placing the child under Christ's direct protection. Prayers became verbal shields. The Ave Maria, the Pater Noster, parents recited these over cradles whenever they felt a fairy threat nearby. The church calendar overlaid the Celtic festival calendar. Samhain became All Saints' Day. Beltane merged with May Day celebrations. These transitions weren't clean. People continued observing old festivals, but added Christian elements. The sacred year became layered, with Christian and pagan meanings coexisting. Finally, we need to examine how clergy dealt with fairy belief. The official church position was clear. Belief in fairies was superstition. But in practice, priests took more nuanced approaches. Many rural priests, themselves from fairy-believing communities, didn't entirely reject the beliefs. When parishioners came worried about changeling children, these priests didn't mock the concern. Instead, they offered Christian solutions. Rather than leaving the baby on a riverbank, perform baptism immediately. Rather than testing with boiling eggshells, pray over the child and sprinkle holy water. This created an interesting dynamic. The priest officially didn't believe in fairy substitution, but he acted as if he did, or as if his parishioners' belief was reasonable enough to address seriously. Some priests explicitly leveraged fairy fear to encourage religious compliance. Sermons warned that unbaptized children were especially vulnerable. This wasn't just folklore. It was strategic use of existing belief to promote sacramental participation. The Church also used fairy belief to explain and reinforce moral boundaries. Sermons might suggest that families who neglected Mass made themselves vulnerable to fairy interference. Righteousness offered protection. Sin created openings. However, some clergy fought against dangerous fairy practices. When word reached a priest that a family planned to test a suspected changeling with fire, some intervened directly. They'd forbid the practice, offer blessings as alternatives. The tension between tolerating and condemning fairy belief created inconsistency. In one village, the priest might actively participate in anti-fairy rituals. In the next, the priest might denounce fairy belief entirely. Families developed their own syncretism. They used both iron and crucifixes. They prayed to God and left offerings at fairy forts. The result was a religious landscape officially Christian, but deeply infused with pre-Christian belief. Ireland converted politically and institutionally, but spiritually, the conversion was partial. Consider how this affected theological understanding. Official church doctrine said angels and demons existed, but not fairies. Yet everyone knew fairies existed. The compromise was classifying fairies as types of fallen angels. Saints themselves often showed remarkable similarity to the gods they replaced. Saint Brigid absorbed attributes of the goddess Brigid so completely that distinguishing between them became impossible. By the 19th century, you had situations where deeply Catholic families still believed in fairies and took changeling fears seriously. These weren't contradictory identities. They were integrated worldviews where Christianity and fairy belief coexisted comfortably. Christianity gave fairy belief new life, new vocabulary, new justification. Fairies stopped being gods and became fallen angels, which made them more believable, not less. The merger of pagan and Christian ideas created something more durable than either alone. Next, we'll examine specific historical cases where changeling belief led to tragedy. Having explored how changeling belief functioned in theory, we now face its terrible practice. Real people in documented cases acted on changeling beliefs with tragic consequences. These were court cases, newspaper accounts, testimonies trying to make sense of incomprehensible actions. The most famous changeling case is Bridget Cleary, killed in March 1895 in County Tipperary. She was 26, married to Michael Cleary, a cooper. She'd been ill with what was probably pneumonia. During her illness, Michael became convinced she'd been replaced by a fairy. Michael, assisted by Bridget's father, aunt and cousins, subjected her to tests. They held her over the kitchen fire. They forced her to drink herbal concoctions. They demanded she answer questions to prove her identity. On the night of March 15th, Michael held Bridget over the fire, demanding she acknowledge her true identity. He said he was burning out the fairy, and his real wife would come down the chimney. Bridget's clothes caught fire. She died from her burns. Michael initially claimed she'd disappeared, that the fairies had taken her. He told neighbours that on the following Sunday night, Bridget would return riding a white horse, and he needed to cut the bindings to free her from fairy enchantment. Several people gathered near a local fairy fort, waiting for this return. When Bridget's body was discovered in a shallow grave, Michael was arrested. The trial became an international sensation. Newspapers across Britain and Ireland covered it extensively. The case became a symbol of Irish backwardness, peasant superstition, the need for education and modernization. Michael was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury accepted that he genuinely believed he was fighting fairies, not killing his wife. He was sentenced to 20 years but released after 15. He emigrated to Canada and disappeared from the historical record. The Bridget Cleary case matters because of its timing. 1895, near the end of the 19th century, when these beliefs should have been fading. Yet here was an educated couple destroyed by changeling belief. An earlier case involved Anne Roche in 1826. She was tried for the death of a 4-year-old boy named Michael Leahy. The boy had developmental disabilities. Descriptions suggest cerebral palsy or severe autism. Anne, acting as a fairy doctor, performed what was called a bathing ritual. She immersed the boy repeatedly in the Flesk River, a traditional test meant to force fairies to return the real child. The cold water shock killed him. At her trial, Anne showed no remorse and seemed confused about why she was being prosecuted. She'd done what people had always done for suspected changelings. That the child died simply proved he was a changeling. A real child would have survived. The court struggled with this. Anne clearly believed she was helping. She had no malicious intent. She was ultimately acquitted because proving intent was difficult. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers documented smaller incidents. A mother in Scotland was arrested for leaving her baby overnight on a hillside. A family in Wales investigated for holding their child over fire. Many incidents probably went unreported. Only when someone died or neighbours were horrified enough to involve authorities did these practices enter the official record. Court systems struggled to handle these cases because they required navigating between incompatible worldviews. The legal system operated on rationalist principles. Changeling belief operated on magical principles. Prosecutors had to convince juries that the accused had committed crimes, but the accused often showed no consciousness of wrongdoing. Defense attorneys sometimes argued temporary insanity, claiming fairy belief represented delusion, but this insulted the accused and their communities who shared the beliefs. Other strategies emphasized lack of intent. The accused hadn't meant to kill, only to cure. This argument sometimes worked, getting murder charges reduced to manslaughter. Juries were particularly conflicted when they came from the same rural areas. They might not personally believe but understood the belief, remembering grandparents who practiced similar things. Convicting someone for following tradition felt wrong, even if the outcome was terrible. Sentences reflected this ambivalence. Even when convicted, defendants often received lighter sentences. Newspaper coverage reveals changing public attitudes. Early in the 19th century, papers reported changeling cases matter-of-factly, sometimes sympathetically. By the late 1800s, coverage was increasingly scandalized, using these cases as evidence that rural areas needed education and modernization. The Bridget Cleary case generated particular outrage. British newspapers used it to argue that Ireland was too backward for self-governance. Irish newspapers defensively argued the case was isolated, that Ireland was modernizing rapidly. Modern anthropologists and historians see something different. They see desperate people with limited resources making sense of inexplicable suffering, using the only frameworks their culture provided. From this perspective, changeling belief wasn't mere superstition. It was an explanatory system that gave people ways to process infant mortality, developmental disabilities, and mysterious illnesses when medicine offered nothing. Modern medical historians examining old changeling descriptions see undiagnosed conditions. The baby who ate constantly but stayed thin, probably cystic fibrosis or metabolic disorder. The child who suddenly stiffened, cerebral palsy. The infant with an ancient-looking face, progeria or genetic syndrome. Every supposed changeling sign maps onto medical conditions. This reinterpretation offers compassion for the parents without excusing the violence. They weren't evil people torturing children they knew were human. They were suffering people doing what they genuinely believed would save their children. Consider what life was like for a rural Irish family with a disabled or chronically ill child in the 1800s. No social services, no medical interventions, no support systems, just grinding daily difficulty, caring for a child who would never improve, watching them suffer, unable to help. Changeling belief offered a different story. Your child wasn't broken. Your child was stolen but whole somewhere else. The psychological relief this narrative provided was immense. It transformed guilt into action, hopelessness into hope. But that same relief enabled horror. When you believe the suffering creature in your arms isn't your child, when you believe the right ritual will bring your real baby back, what won't you try? The decline of changeling belief correlates directly with the rise of modern medicine and social services. As doctors began appearing in rural areas, offering different explanations and actual treatments for some conditions, the desperate need for supernatural explanations weakened. When a doctor could explain that your child had colic and would outgrow it, you didn't need fairy explanations. Education played a role too. As literacy spread, as schools reached rural areas, as people gained access to scientific explanations, magical thinking generally declined. Legal prosecution mattered as well. After high-profile cases like Bridget Cleary, authorities took changeling accusations more seriously. The threat of prosecution deterred some people from acting on beliefs they might still hold. Yet the belief didn't vanish entirely. Ethnographers working in rural Ireland in the early 20th century still found people who believed, still found families taking precautions. As late as 2011, a survey found roughly 20% of Irish respondents claimed to respect fairy places, a softened way of saying they maintained some version of the belief. The documented historical cases teach us that belief systems don't die cleanly. They fade gradually, transform into nostalgia or cultural memory, persist in modified forms. And while they exist, they continue shaping behavior, sometimes beautifully, protecting ancient monuments, sometimes tragically, when desperate people act on beliefs that contradict reality. Next, we'll explore how changeling mythology survives in modern culture. Having traced changeling belief from origins through tragedy to decline, we end by exploring how these stories survive in modern consciousness. The literal belief has largely faded, but the changeling myth persists, transformed into metaphor, inspiration for art, and subject of ongoing scholarly interest. Irish literary revival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries embraced fairy mythology as part of Irish cultural identity. Writers like William Butler Yeats, Lady Wilde, and Thomas Crofton Croker collected and adapted these tales. Yeats's poem, The Stolen Child, written in 1889, became one of the most famous literary treatments. The poem depicts fairies luring a child away from the sorrowful human world to their realm of beauty and escape. Yeats' version is notably gentler than the folklore. His fairies aren't malicious child stealers, but beings offering escape from suffering. This transformation is typical of how Victorian writers approached fairy material. They softened it, made it aesthetic rather than terrifying. Lady Wilde collected extensive fairy folklore in Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. Her work preserved changeling stories in remarkable detail. Thomas Crofton Croker's collections captured fairy belief at its height, before modernization began eroding it. These literary collections served multiple purposes. They preserved dying oral traditions in written form. They contributed to Irish cultural nationalism by demonstrating Ireland's rich mythological heritage. And they transformed active belief into cultural artifact, something to be studied rather than feared. Modern literature continues engaging with changeling themes. Contemporary fantasy authors frequently use changeling plots, though often inverting the original dynamics. The changeling might be the protagonist rather than the threat. The story might explore the changeling's experience rather than the parents. Film has discovered changeling mythology as rich source material. Movies like The Hallow from 2015 and The Hole in the Ground from 2019 use changeling plots to create psychological horror. These films tap into primal parental fears. What if your child isn't your child? Modern film treatments often explore the psychological dimension more than the supernatural. The horror comes from the parent's uncertainty, the breakdown of recognition. This reflects contemporary concerns about mental health, rather than literal fairy belief. The word changeling itself has evolved in meaning. In current usage, it often describes someone who doesn't fit their origins, who seems switched at birth metaphorically. A changeling child might mean someone whose talents differ dramatically from their family. The term has become shorthand for displacement, for the experience of being in the wrong place. This metaphorical usage appears in discussions of adoption, of children who feel they don't belong in their families, of people who discover hidden heritage. While literature transformed changeling beliefs into art, archaeologists and folklorists continued studying the physical and cultural evidence. Archaeological study of Irish ring forts reveals their Iron Age farmsteads dating from roughly 500 BCE to 1000 CE. They're not fairy dwellings, but human constructions. Yet the folklore attached to them provides insight into how communities related to mysterious ancient structures. The fact that these sites remain protected means they've survived in remarkable condition. Fairy belief, whatever its errors, inadvertently preserved archaeological treasures. Newgrange, Noath, and other Neolithic passage tombs considered fairy realm entrances have been excavated extensively. They date to approximately 3200 BCE, making them older than Stonehenge. The astronomical alignments, the engineering sophistication, all of this was mysterious to medieval Celts. No wonder they seem supernatural. Folklorists continue collecting and analyzing fairy beliefs as windows into how pre-modern communities understood their world. Medical and genetic historians have begun re-examining old changeling descriptions, attempting retrospective diagnosis. This work is speculative but reveals how medical conditions were perceived before modern diagnosis existed. Autism spectrum disorder appears frequently in these reinterpretations. The unusual intelligence, the adult-like expressions, the difficulty with social connection, all match both changeling descriptions and autism characteristics. Cerebral palsy matches descriptions of babies who stiffened. Colic and reflux explain inconsolable crying. This medical reinterpretation doesn't diminish the parent's suffering. It contextualizes it. They weren't imagining their children's differences. They were observing real conditions and explaining them within their available framework. Finally, we need to ask why changeling mythology continues resonating despite fading literal belief. Changeling myths speak to fundamental anxieties about identity and belonging. The fear that you're not who you think you are, that you don't truly belong, that your real life exists somewhere else. These concerns transcend historical periods. The metaphor of being swapped at birth appears in discussions of anyone who feels they're living the wrong life. Parental anxiety also makes changeling stories perpetually relevant. Every parent sometimes looks at their child and feels a moment of not recognizing this strange creature they created. The changeling myth gives form to this uncanny experience. For children who feel different, the changeling story offers strange comfort. Maybe I do belong somewhere else, the different child thinks. It's fantasy, but fantasy that validates the experience of not belonging. Contemporary discussions of neurodiversity sometimes reference changeling mythology. Autistic people have reclaimed the changeling metaphor, using it to describe feeling alien in a world not designed for them. The old stories of fairy children who didn't fit become allegories for neurological difference. This reclamation transforms the changeling from threat into identity. It inverts the moral framework. Maybe the changelings weren't the problem. Maybe the families who rejected different children were the problem. Transgender individuals sometimes reference changeling mythology too, describing the feeling that they're not the person everyone thinks they are. These modern appropriations show how myths evolve to address contemporary concerns. The literal belief dies, but underlying themes, identity, belonging, transformation, remain compelling. The persistence of physical respect for fairy places demonstrates the most tangible legacy. Even people who don't literally believe still avoid disturbing certain sites. Construction projects still detour around old mounds. This continued respect stems partly from superstition and partly from cultural memory. These sites carry historical weight. When you drive through rural Ireland and see a lone hawthorn tree standing in an otherwise cultivated field, you're witnessing belief made physical. That tree stands because generations refused to cut it. This is perhaps the most beautiful legacy. The beliefs that sometimes led to tragedy also preserved landscapes, protected ancient sites, and maintained connections to pre-Christian history. The changeling myth's survival in multiple forms, literary, archaeological, metaphorical, physical, demonstrates that powerful stories never entirely die. They transform, adapt, find new meanings. The literal belief fades, but the essential story persists because it touches something fundamental in human experience. We're storytelling creatures. We make narratives to explain what confuses us, to give form to our fears, to imagine alternatives. The changeling story served all these functions for centuries. It explained inexplicable suffering. It gave form to parental anxiety. It imagined that lost children might exist somewhere safe. Modern retellings strip away literal supernatural elements while preserving the emotional core. We no longer believe in fairies stealing children, but we understand the feeling these stories address, the terror of loss, the hope for recovery, the desperate search for explanations when none exist. The changeling conspiracy reveals how communities process tragedy, how beliefs evolve under religious change, how stories survive their original context. It shows us both the best and worst of human nature, the creative meaning-making that helps us endure suffering, and the tragic consequences when belief overrides compassion. The empty cradles of the past, the children called changelings, the families destroyed by belief. They deserve to be remembered not as curiosities, but as evidence of how desperately humans seek understanding. The fairy forts still stand, the stories still circulate, and we, looking back across centuries, can see both the beauty and horror in beliefs that once shaped Celtic life.